M.I.T. must be relaxing its standards if this many people can show up right on the eve of finals. Can't believe it. Well, just how dangerous is the crisis in the Middle East? There is a UN special envoy, a Norwegian, Rode Larsen. A couple of days ago, he warned that Israel's blockade of the Palestinian areas is leading to enormous suffering and could rapidly detonate a regional war. Notice he referred to the blockade. He didn't refer to the killings and other atrocities. And he's right about that. The blockade is the crucial tactic. There can be a blockade, which is very effective because of the way the so-called peace process has evolved under U.S. direction, meaning hundreds of isolated Palestinian enclaves, some of them tiny, which can be blocked off and strangled by the Israeli occupying forces. That's the basic structure of what's called here the peace process. So there can be an extremely effective blockade, and a blockade is a sensible tactic for the United States and Israel, and it's always together. Remember that anything that Israel does, it does by U.S. authorization and usually subsidy and support. The blockade is a tactic to fine-tune the atrocities so that they don't become too visible, visible enough to force Washington to, or the West means Washington essentially, to make some kind of response. There have been mistakes in the past, and the United States and Israel have certainly learned from them. So in 1996, for example, when Shimon Peres launched yet another attack on Lebanon, killing large numbers of people and driving hundreds of thousands out of their home, it was fine. The U.S. was able to support it, and Clinton did support it, up until one mistake, when they bombed a UN camp in Qana and killed over 100 people who were refugees in the camp. Clinton at first justified it, but as the international reaction came in, he had to back off, and Israel was forced under U.S. orders, in effect, to call off the operation and withdraw. That's the kind of mistake you want to avoid. So for those of you going into the diplomatic service, remember, you don't want to carry out, allow that kind of mistake to happen. You want low-level atrocities fine-tuned so that an international response is unnecessary. Same thing happened more recently, just a year ago, last September, when the U.S. backed slaughter in East Timor, which had been going on nicely for about 25 years, finally got out of hand to such a degree that Clinton was compelled, after the country was virtually destroyed, to essentially tell the Indonesian generals that the game's over, and they instantly withdrew. So that you want to avoid. It's important to keep, in this particular case, there's a clear effort to keep killings, which is what hits the front pages, to keep killings at roughly the level of Kosovo before the NATO bombing. In fact, that's about the level of killings right now, so that the story will sort of fade into the background. Now, of course, the Kosovo story was quite different. At that time, the propaganda needs were the opposite. So therefore, the killings under fairly similar circumstances, then much more, then in fact they were attacks from across the border. So it would be as if Hezbollah was carrying out attacks in the Galilee or something like that. But the level of Serbian response was approximately like Israel's response in the occupied territories. At that time, the propaganda needs were different, so therefore it was described passionately as genocide. But a well-designed propaganda system can make those distinctions. So in that case, it was genocide. In this case, it's unnoticeable and justified reprisal. Well, the general idea, and I think you can expect this to continue for a while, is for the tactics to be restricted to assassination, lots and lots of people wounded severely, many of them will die later, but that doesn't enter into consciousness. Starvation, according to the UN, there's about 600,000 people facing starvation, but again, that's below the level. And curfews, 24-hour curfews, like in Hebron for weeks at a time, while a couple hundred Israeli settlers are strut around freely, but the rest of the population, tens of thousands of people, is locked in their homes, allowed out a couple hours a week. The isolation in the hundreds of enclaves, sieges, and so on, so that suffering can be kept below the level that might elicit a Western response. And the assumption, which is pretty plausible, is that there's a limit to what people can endure, and ultimately they'll give up. Well, there is, however, a problem in the Arab world, which is more sensitive to these massive atrocities, and it could explode, and that's what Rod Larson is warning about. The governance of in the Arab world is extremely fragile, especially in the crucial oil-producing region, and any popular unrest might threaten the very fragile rule of the U.S. client, which the U.S. would be unwilling to accept, and it might, equally unacceptable, induce the rulers of the oil monarchies to move to improve relations with, particularly with Iran, which in fact they've already been doing, which would undermine the whole framework for U.S. domination of the world's major energy reserves. Back in 1994, Clinton's National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, explained what he described. He described what he called a paradigm for post-Cold War, for the post-Cold War era. And for the Middle East, it would be the paradigm was what's called dual containment, so contain Iraq and Iran. But as he pointed out, dual containment relies crucially on the Oslo process, a process that brings about relative peace between Israel and the Arabs. And unless that can be sustained, the dual containment can't be sustained, and the whole U.S. policy, current policy for controlling the region will be in serious danger. That's happened already. In just 2 years ago, in December 1998, when the U.S. and Britain bombed Iraq in a very with outright and very explicit contempt for world opinion, including the UN Security Council. Remember that the bombing was timed just at the moment when the Security Council was having an emergency session to consider the problems of inspection in Iraq. And as they began, they got the announcement that the U.S. and Britain had preempted it by bombing. That and the events before it led to a very negative reaction in the Arab world and elsewhere for that matter, and did lead to very visible steps, particularly by the Saudi ruling monarchy, but also others, towards accommodation to Iran and indication of some degree of acceptance of an Iranian position that has been around for a while, that there should be a strategic alliance in the region that's independent of Western, meaning primarily U.S. power. That's something that the U.S. is highly unlikely to accept and could lead to very dangerous consequences. Furthermore, on top of this, the countries of the region, Iran and Syria in particular, are testing missiles which might be able to reach Israel. The United States and Israel are working not only on missiles, but also on an anti-missile system, the Arrow anti-missile system. When armaments are at that level, tensions can easily break out suddenly and unpredictably and lead to a war with advanced weapons, which can get out of hand pretty quickly. Well, how dangerous is that? Turn to another expert, General Lee Butler, recently retired. He was head of the Strategic Command at the highest nuclear agency under Clinton, Stratcom. He wrote a couple of years ago that it's dangerous in the extreme that in the cauldron of animosities that we call the Middle East, one nation has armed itself ostensibly with stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the hundreds, and that inspires other nations to do so as well, and also to develop other weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent, which is highly combustible and can lead to very dangerous outcomes. All of this is still more dangerous when the sponsor of that one nation is regarded generally in the world as a rogue state, which is unpredictable and out of control. It's irrational and vindictive, and insists on portraying itself in that fashion. In fact, the Strategic Command under Clinton has, in its highest level pronouncement, has advised that the United States should maintain a national persona, as they call it, of being irrational and vindictive and out of control, so that the rest of the world will be frightened, and they are, and should also, the U.S. should also rely on nuclear weapons as the core of its strategy, including the right of first use against non-nuclear states, including those that have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And those proposals have been built into presidential directives, Clinton-era presidential directives. Doesn't make much noise around here, but it's understood in the world, which is naturally impelled to respond by developing weapons of mass destruction of its own in self-defense. These are prospects that are indeed recognized by U.S. intelligence and high-level U.S. analysts. About 2 years ago, Harvard professor Samuel Huntington wrote an article in a very prestigious journal, Foreign Affairs, in which he pointed out that for much of the world, he indicated most of the world, the United States is considered a dangerous rogue state and the main threat to their national existence. And it's not surprising if you look at what happens in the world from outside the framework of the U.S. indoctrination system. That's very plausible, even from documents, and certainly from actions, and much of the world does see it that way. That adds to the severe dangers of the situation. Well, the recent history of the Middle East provides quite a few further warnings. I'll just mention one example, which is very crucial in the present context right now. That's 1967. That's when, in the June 1967 war, when Israel destroyed the Arab armies, the armies of the Arab states, Egypt the most important, and it conquered the currently occupied territories that set the stage for what's still going on right now. At that time, the Soviet Union was still around, and the conflict there became serious enough so it almost led to a war, a nuclear war, which would have been the end of the story. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara later observed, in his words, "We damn near had war," at the end of the June war. There were hotline communications. Apparently, President Kosygin warned that if you want to have war, you can have it. There were naval confrontations between the Russian and the U.S. fleets in the Eastern Mediterranean. There was also another case. There was an Israeli attack on a U.S. spy ship, USS Liberty, which killed I think about 35 sailors and crewmen and practically sank the ship. The Liberty didn't know who was being attacked, who was attacking it. The attackers were disguised. They did get before they were disabled. They got messages back to the Sixth Fleet headquarters in Naples, who also didn't know who was attacking it. They sent out phantoms, which were nuclear armed, because they didn't have any that weren't nuclear armed, to respond to whoever was attacking it, and they didn't know who they were supposed to bomb. Russia, Egypt, anybody. Apparently the planes were called back directly from the Pentagon just at sort of the last moment, but that event alone could have led to a nuclear war. All of this was understood to be extremely hazardous. Most of this probably had to do with Israel's plans to conquer the Golan Heights, Syrian Golan Heights, which they did after the ceasefire. And they didn't want the United States to know about it in advance because the U.S. would have stopped them. And probably that's what lies behind most of this. Documents aren't out, so we can only speculate. And they'll probably never come out. Anyhow, the situation was ominous enough so that the great powers on all sides figured they better put a stop to it. And they very quickly met at the Security Council and accepted a resolution, UN 242, the famous UN 242 from November 1967, which laid out a framework for a diplomatic settlement. And it's worth paying close attention to what UN 242 was and is. And it's different now from what it was then. The information about this is public, technically, but barely known, and often distorted, so just pay attention to what it is. You can easily check it if you like. UN 242 called for, the basic idea was full peace in return for full withdrawal. So Israel would withdraw from the territories it had just conquered, and in return the Arab states would agree to a full peace with it. There was a kind of a minor footnote that the withdrawal could involve minor and mutual adjustments. So, for example, if some line is curved, they could straighten it out, that sort of thing. But that was the policy, and that was U.S. policy. It was under U.S. initiative. So full peace in return for full withdrawal. Notice that this UN, very crucially, and that's very crucial now, UN 242 was completely rejectionist. I use the term rejectionist now in a slightly non-standard sense, in a non-racist sense. It's usually used in a completely racist sense. So the rejectionists are those who deny Israel's rights to national self-determination. But of course, there's two national groups contesting, and I'm using the term rejectionist in a neutral sense, hence non-standard, to refer to denial of the rights of either of the two contestants, denial of Palestinian rights. That terminology is never used in the United States and can't be used, because if it is used, it'll turn out that the United States is the leader of the rejectionist camp, and we can't have that. So therefore, the term is always used in a racist sense. So you'll understand that I'm switching from normal usage now. UN 242 was completely rejectionist. It offered nothing to the Palestinians. There was no reference to them except the phrase that there was a refugee problem that somehow had to be dealt with. That's it. Apart from that, it was to be an agreement among states. The states were to reach a full peace treaties in the context of complete Israeli withdrawal from the territories. That's UN 242. Well, without proceeding, for the local people in the region, the Israelis and the Palestinians, the crisis is obviously extremely grave. It could lead to a regional war that could easily escalate to a global war with weapons of mass destruction, with consequences that are unimaginable, and that could happen at almost any time. Secondly, the U.S. role is highly significant. That's always true throughout the world just because of U.S. power, but it's particularly true in the Middle East, which has been recognized in high-level planning for 50 years, and it goes back beyond that, but explicitly for 50 years has been recognized as one of a core element in U.S. global planning. Just to quote documents from 50 years ago, declassified documents, the Middle East was described as the strategically most important region of the world, a stupendous source of strategic power, the richest economic prize in the world, and on in the same vein. The U.S. is not going to give that up. It also control over, and the reason is very simple, that's the world's major energy reserves, and the U.S., not only are they valuable to have because of the enormous profit that comes from them, but control over them gives a kind of veto power over the actions of others for obvious reasons, which were recognized right away at the time. So that's core issue. It's been at the prime concern of U.S. military and strategic planning for half a century. It's the Gulf region, the region of the major energy reserves, has also always been the target of the major U.S. intervention forces with a base system that extends over a good part of the world, from the Pacific to the Azores, with consequences for all of those regions because they are bases, backup bases for the intervention forces targeting the Gulf region, also including the Indian Ocean, which is a big issue right now in England at least and in much of the world, but not in the United States. The inhabitants of an Indian Ocean island, Diego Garcia, were kicked out and unceremoniously dumped on another island, Mauritius, some years ago, and they've been, those who managed to survive it have been fighting through this was a British dependency, through the British courts to try to gain the right to return to their homes. They finally won a couple of months ago in the High Court in England and were granted the right to return, except that the U.S. won't relinquish the island, where it has a major military base that's used for the Middle East targeted forces. Just a couple of days ago, they asked for indemnities, about $6 billion, but the U.S. is refusing, of course. Madeleine Albright commented on it. She said it's just an issue between Britain and Mauritius. We don't have anything to do with it, even though we hold the island and refuse to allow them to return and let them refuse to pay indemnities. And I think you'll search pretty far to find some discussion of this in the U.S. press. I haven't seen any. But that's part of the base system for targeting the Middle East. For years, there was a kind of a public pretext for all of this. The public pretext was that we had to defend ourselves against the Russians. That was the pretext for everything. So it was the pretext for this in particular. There's a pretty rich internal record of declassified documents, and it tells quite a different story. The story it tells is that the Russians were at most a marginal factor, or often no factor. But fortunately, there's no need to debate the matter anymore because it's been conceded publicly. It was conceded, in fact, immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which sort of got rid of the pretext. Can't appeal to the Russian threat anymore. A couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Bush administration submitted its annual message to Congress calling for a huge military budget. And it was a very interesting document. Unfortunately, it wasn't reported, but it was very important, obviously. It's the first call for huge military budget after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when you can't appeal to the Russians anymore, so therefore it's revealing, tells you what's really going on. And as expected, the Russian threat was gone. We don't need a huge Pentagon budget because of the Russians, who aren't around anymore, but we still need it. In fact, it turned out to be exactly as it was in the past, and we needed it for reasons which are now frankly expressed. We needed it because of what they call the technological sophistication of third world countries, which is a way of saying they pose a danger of becoming independent. And we need it because we have to maintain what's called the defense industrial base, which is what pays our salaries, among other things. The defense industrial base is it's a term for high-tech industry, which has to be funded by the public, which has to bear the costs of and risks of development. That's M.I.T. is one of the funnels for that, and that has to be maintained. We have to keep the source of the dynamic sectors of the economy, which are substantially in the public center, so we have to maintain the defense industrial base, and we also have to keep the intervention forces that we've always had still targeting the Middle East, the Gulf region, and then it adds targeting the Gulf region where the threat to our interests that involve possible military action could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, contrary to half a century, 40 years of lies. So sorry, folks, we've been lying to you, but we still need them there because of the technological sophistication of the third world powers, that is, the threat that they may become independent. notice that the threat to our interests could also not be laid at Iraq's door at that time, because Saddam Hussein was still a nice guy. He'd only been gassing Kurds and torturing dissidents and that sort of thing. But he was considered obedient, so he was a friend and ally. This is early 1990, changed a few months later. So that was so we don't have to debate the question of the role of the Russians. It's now conceded that was not significant. Threat could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. And the threat, in fact, is what it is all over the world, and has been right through the Cold War. The threat of what's called radical nationalism or independent nationalism. Doesn't make much of a difference where it is in the political spectrum. But if it's independent, it's a danger, and you have to undermine it. It has a way of threatening what's called stability, that is the subordination of the world to the dominant interests that the U.S. represents. Actually, U.S. relations with Israel developed in that context. The 1967 war was a major step forward when Israel showed its power and its ability to deal with third world radical nationalists who were at that time threatening, particularly Nasser. Nasser was engaged in a kind of a proxy war with Saudi Arabia, which is the most important country, that's where all the oil is, in the Yemen. And Israel put an end to that by smashing Nasser's armies and won a lot of points for that. And U.S. relations with Israel really became solidified at that point. But it had been recognized earlier, 10 years earlier, and the U.S. intelligence had noted that what they called a logical corollary to opposition to radical Arab nationalism is a support for Israel as a reliable base for U.S. power in the region. And Israel's reliable because it's under threat, and therefore it needs U.S. support, which has another logical corollary that from the U.S. interest, it's a good idea for Israel to be under threat. That essentially continues, and a good deal of the relationship is based on the way that context developed. If there was time, I could talk about it, but I'll skip it. Anyhow, we can thankfully put the pretext aside at this point and just look at the reasons, which are now on the table. It's the threat of independent nationalism, and in the case of the Gulf region, that's particularly important because that's the world's major energy reserves. Well, a final consideration, then turn on to the topic, is that the U.S. role is not only the U.S. role is not the only one, of course. It's one factor in a complicated mixture, but it's a decisive factor. And crucially, it's the one factor that's under our control. We can directly influence it. So we can bewail the terrible actions of other people, but we can do something about our own actions. That's a rather critical difference in personal life and in international affairs. And it's illuminating to observe how much attention is given to the crimes of others, which most of the time we can't do anything about, and compare it with the amount of attention that's given to our own crimes, which we can do a great deal about. That's an instructive comparison, and if you take the trouble to work it out, you learn a lot about the intellectual culture in which we live and to which we're expected to contribute. For that reason alone, and it's far from the only one, we ought to be discussing primarily the U.S. role, and furthermore, that role is little understood. It's often just suppressed, which is another reason to focus on it. Well, let me illustrate with things that are happening right at this moment. The Intifada, the current uprising, began on September 29th. That was the day after Ariel Sharon, General Sharon, appeared at the Haram al-Sharif with a lot of troops. That event alone was provocative, but it probably would have gone by without any reaction. What happened the next day, however, was different. The next day is the Friday, the day of prayers, and there was a huge military presence, mostly border guards who are kind of like the paramilitaries, the ones you farm out atrocities to. And they were there in force, and as people came out of the mosques, was obviously extremely provocative. Some rock throwing took place. They shot into the crowds, killed 4 or more people, wounded over 100, and after that it just took off. This is incidentally Barak, not Sharon. It's easy to blame Sharon, and plenty to blame on him for 50 years of atrocities, but this happened to be Barak's planning. On October 1st, let me just consider one aspect of what's gone on since, namely the use of helicopter gunships. On October 1st, so right after this, our U.S. helicopters, of course, Israeli military helicopters, meaning U.S. helicopters with Israeli pilots, killed 2 Palestinians in Gaza. On October 2nd, the next day, they killed 10 Palestinians, wounded 35 others in Gaza at Netzarim, which, if you followed this closely, you'll notice is the scene of many of the major atrocities, including the famous photo of the 12-year-old boy who was killed. What's Netzarim? Well, the fact is Netzarim is just an excuse to split the Gaza Strip in two. There's a small settlement south of Gaza, the only purpose of which is to require a big military outpost to protect it, and the military outpost then requires a road, huge road, which cuts the Gaza Strip in two, so that separates Gaza City, the main population concentration, from the southern part of the Strip and Egypt, and ensures that in any outcome, Gaza will be imprisoned inside Israel, in effect. There's other breaks down farther south, but Netzarim is the main one, and that's where a lot of the atrocities have been. So this October 2nd killing of 10, wounding of 35 at Netzarim was by helicopters is just one of these many incidents. On October 3rd, the next day, the defense correspondent of Haaretz, which is the major serious newspaper, Hebrew newspaper, he reported the largest purchase of military helicopters in a decade. That means U.S. military helicopters. These were Black Hawks and spare parts for Apaches. Apaches are the main attack helicopters. These had been delivered a few weeks earlier. They were getting spare parts, also jet fuel. The next day, October 4th, Jane's Defense Weekly, which is the major military journal in the world, a British military journal, reported that the Clinton administration had further approved a new sale of attack helicopters, Apache attack helicopters, because it had decided that upgrading the ones that they had just sent would not be sufficient, so they really had to send new, more advanced ones. The same day, the Boston Globe reported that Apache attack helicopters were attacking apartment complexes with rockets, again in Netzarim. The international press agencies at that time quoted Pentagon officials as saying, I'm quoting a Pentagon official, U.S. weapon sales do not carry a stipulation that the weapons cannot be used against civilians. We cannot second guess an Israeli commander who calls in helicopter gunships. Okay, so story so far, U.S. helicopter gunships are being used to attack civilians, but they aren't advanced enough and Israel doesn't have enough of them, so therefore the Clinton administration had to move in with the biggest purchase in a decade. Purchase means American taxpayers pay for it in some indirect fashion. And then it had the next day to extend it further, sending new, more advanced Apache helicopters, and there's no stipulation going along with them that they can't be used against civilians. Well, that carries us up to October 4th. Then come more and more attacks on civilians. I'll skip them. The first reference in the U.S. press to any of this is on October 12th. There was an opinion piece in the Raleigh, North Carolina newspaper, which said they thought this was kind of a bad idea. That's also the last reference to it in the U.S. press, meaning the only reference. It's not that editors don't know about this. I mean, of course they know about it. And in fact, it's been explicitly brought to the attention of editors of leading newspapers as if they didn't know already. It's not that it's unimportant, because it's obviously very important. It's just the kind of news that's not fit to print. And that's very typical, not only in this part of the world, but everywhere. It's extremely important that the public be kept in the dark about what's being done, because if they know about it, they're not going to like it. And if they don't like it, they might do something about it. So there's a grave responsibility on the media and on intellectuals generally, the educational system and so on, to ensure that people are kept in the dark about things that it's better for them not to know, like this, for example. And the task is carried out with very impressive dedication. This is not an untypical example. Also on October 19th, Amnesty International published a report condemning the United States for providing new military helicopters to Israel. They're also reporting the atrocities. That was not reported in the United States. It was elsewhere. On November 10th, Amnesty International published a much broader condemnation of the excessive use of force and terror and so on. That barely was mentioned. And so it continues. Well, let's turn to the question, what can we do? The answer is we have choices. We can do a lot. So, for example, we can continue to provide helicopter gunships and other military support to ensure that Israel is able to attack civilians, maintain a blockade, starve them to death, and so on. And we can provide the funding that allows Israel to continue to integrate the occupied territories within Israel proper, as it's been doing, settlements, infrastructure, etc. This all goes on. Doesn't matter which government is in office. It goes on under Barak about the same way it did under Netanyahu, and it's anticipated to go on next year. The budget provisions have already been made for next year. So we can continue with that if we like, or we can act to stop our participation in these activities. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't require bombing or sanctions. Just means stop participating in atrocities. Easiest thing to do. That's a choice. And in fact, we can even go further and call them off, as is pretty easily done when a country has the power that the United States has. I gave a couple of examples. Well, if we decide on the latter choice, which is always open here and elsewhere, there's a prerequisite. The prerequisite is that we know what's going on. So you can't make that choice, say, to stop providing military helicopters. And notice that that's just an illustration of a much bigger picture. You can't make that choice unless you know about it. And that, again, is the grave responsibility of the intellectual world, the media, journals, universities, and others, is to prevent people from knowing. And that takes effort. It's not easy, as in this case, takes some dedication to suppress the facts and make sure that the population doesn't know what's being done in their name. Because if they do, they're not going to like it, and they'll respond, and then you get into trouble. Well, the very same applies to the diplomatic record. Let me turn to that. Let's begin with the current phase of diplomacy, what started on September 1993. That's the famous Oslo process. September 1993, there was a meeting on the White House lawn, very august. The Boston Globe had a headline describing it as a day of awe. The Israel and the Palestinians agreed under Clinton's supervision to what was called a Declaration of Principles. There were at that time a number of issues, and it's crucial to understand how the Declaration of Principles dealt with them. Okay, so one issue was territory. What's going to happen to the occupied territories? How are they going to be? How are they going to be assigned? That's issue number one. Number two is the issue of national rights. Now, that issue only arises for Palestinians. There's no question in the case of Israel. It's just not in question and hasn't been in question at all. The only question is, what about the rights of the Palestinians? The third question is, what about the right to resist? Do the Palestinians, or the Lebanese for that matter, have the right to resist military occupation? That's the third question. And the fourth question, which is a kind of a counterpart to that, is, does the occupying power, does Israel have which means the U.S. here, have the right to attack in the occupied territories and in Lebanon? Those are the four main questions. Well, there were answers in the Declaration of Principles. With regard to territory, the Declaration of Principles stated that the permanent settlement would be on the basis of UN 242. But that raises a question. What does UN 242 mean? Here we have to go to the earlier diplomatic record. I'll return to it in a moment. The second, with regard to national rights, again, is settled in terms of UN 242. And anyone who was paying attention in September 1993 could see exactly where this was going. The Declaration of Principles states that the permanent settlement, long-term outcome, at the end of the road, will be based on UN 242 alone. Now, for 20 years, the issue in international diplomacy had been the rejectionism of UN 242. Remember, UN 242 says nothing about the Palestinians. Since for 20 years there had been a series of efforts to supplement, by the whole world, I'll come back to it a bit, to supplement UN 242 to include Palestinian rights alongside the rights of Israel, which were never in question. That was the issue from the mid-70s right up till Oslo, and the U.S. won flat out on that one. Palestinian rights are not to be considered. It's just UN 242, no Palestinian rights. They're not mentioned, and that's the permanent settlement. So territories, it's UN 242, which means what the U.S. decides. I'll come back to that. National rights, U.S. wins flat out. The rest of the world capitulates. What about the right to resist? Well, Arafat agreed at the signing of the Declaration of Principles to abandon any right to resist. And it's taken for granted that in Lebanon the population also has no right to resist. It's called terrorism if they resist. Why did Arafat have to state this? Actually, he said it over and over again. He made solemn pronouncement to that effect over and over. But the purpose here was just pure humiliation. You have to make sure to humiliate the lower breeds and to make sure that they don't, get too big for their britches. George Shultz, Secretary of State, who's considered something of a dove, put it pretty plainly. He said, it's true that Arafat has said unk, and he said but he hasn't said uncle in a sufficiently submissive tone. And we got to make sure that he does over and over again. That's the way you treat the lower breeds. So once again, Arafat had to say uncle loudly and submissively, and thank you, Massa, and sign a statement saying, yeah, once again, we reject the right to resist. Same in Lebanon, it isn't even a question. What about the fourth question, the right to attack? Kind of counterpart, Israel's right to attack. Well, it retained that right, and it continues to use it repeatedly with U.S. support before and after. Notice that over this period there is virtually no defensive pretext, contrary to what you read in U.S. commentary. That goes way back. But contrary to propaganda, almost the entire series of Israeli attacks, certainly in the occupied territories, but in Lebanon as well, were not for any defensive purpose. They were initiated. That includes the 1982 invasion. And that's no small matter. I mean, it's not considered a big deal here, but during the 22 years that Israel illegally occupied southern Lebanon in violation of Security Council orders, but with U.S. authorization, during that time they killed about maybe 45 or 50,000 Lebanese and Palestinians. Not a trivial number. And this included many very brutal attacks going on after the Oslo Accords as well, 1983, 1986, and so on. And so you might again want to compare this with Serbia and Kosovo. The comparison in this case has to be kind of like a thought experiment because it never happened. But imagine if Serbia had been bombing Albania to the extent that Israel was bombing Lebanon. That would be an analogy. Didn't happen, but you can just imagine what the reaction would have been. Tells you again something about our values and the need to maintain discipline on these issues so people don't think it through. The PLO accepted all of this just abjectly. Israel, in return, in the Declaration of Principles, committed itself to absolutely nothing. If you take a look back at what happened on the White House lawn on the day of awe, Prime Minister Rabin made a very terse comment, a couple of lines, in which after Arafat had agreed to all this stuff, and he said that Israel would now recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians, period. Nothing about national rights, nothing. We'll just recognize you as the representative of the Palestinians. And his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, considered a dove, explained why right away in Israel, in Hebrew. He said, well, yeah, we can recognize them now because they've capitulated. So there's no problem in recognizing them. They can now become a kind of a junior partner in controlling the Palestinian population, which follows a traditional colonial pattern. Israel and the United States had made a rather serious error in the occupied territories. It's not a good idea to try to control a subject population with your own troops. The way it's usually done is you farm it out to the natives. That's the way the British ran India for, a couple hundred years. India was mostly controlled by Indian troops, often taken from other regions, like the Gurkhas and so on. That's the way the United States runs Central America, with mercenary forces, which are called armies, if you can keep them under control. That's the way South Africa ran, the black areas. Most of the atrocities are carried out by black mercenaries. And in the Bantustans, it was entirely blacks. That's the standard colonial pattern. It makes a lot of sense. If you have your own troops out there, it causes all kinds of problems. First of all, they suffer injuries, and these are people who don't like to, they don't feel good about killing people, and their parents get upset, and so on and so forth. If you have mercenaries or paramilitaries, you don't have those problems. So Israel was, in fact, going to turn, Israel and the United States were going to turn to the standard colonial pattern and have the Palestinian forces, who in fact mostly came from Tunis, control the local population, control them economically and politically as well as militarily. That was the idea. A sensible reversion to standard colonial practice. Well, let's take a look back now, move a little back at the earlier diplomatic record, which helps put all of this in context. So what about the right to resist? The right to resist military occupation in the territories and in Lebanon. That actually has been discussed in the international community, though you wouldn't know it here. In December 1987, which was right at the peak of all the furor about international terrorism, the plague of the modern world, and so on and so forth, the UN General Assembly considered and passed a resolution condemning terrorism very strongly. International terrorism, worst crime there is, and had all the right wording in it, and so on and so forth. The resolution was passed 153-2, which is actually pretty normal. The two were the usual ones, the United States and Israel. One country only abstained, Honduras, for unknown reasons. So it was essentially unanimous, except for the United States and Israel. Now, why would the United States and Israel reject, and that means veto if it's a U.S. vote against, a resolution denouncing terrorism? Well, the reason is because it contained one paragraph which said that nothing in this resolution prejudices the right of people to struggle against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation, and to gain the support of others for their struggle for freedom in these conditions. Well, that the U.S. won't accept, of course. For example, that would have given the ANC in South Africa the right to resist the South African regime, which is unacceptable. And it would have given the Lebanese the right to resist Israeli military occupation and attacks, which can't be accepted, and it would have extended to the occupied territories as well. So therefore, the U.S. and Israel rejected it, and in fact, as usual, it's vetoed from history. It was never reported here, It's never mentioned. Might as well not exist unless you read dissident literature. It's there. I mean, you go to the UN dusty records, you can find it. But that's the right to resist, which was blocked by the United States in 1987 and is out of history. What about the right to attack? Well, that exists by U.S. fiat. As I mentioned, during the 22 years of Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon with U.S. authorization, they killed tens of thousands of people, probably 40 to 50,000. And it's not just they, and there are plenty of atrocities. Paris's Iron Fist operations in 1985, for example. But it's not only there. The right extends much further. So 1985 and 1986 are interesting years. That was the peak of the hysteria about international terrorism, top story and so on and so forth. And in fact, there was plenty of international terrorism in those years. For example, in 1985, Israel bombed Tunis, killing 75 people, Tunisians and Palestinians, no pretext. The United States backed it, publicly backed it, in fact, although Schultz, then Secretary of State, backed off when the Security Council condemned it unanimously as an act of armed aggression, namely a war crime, U.S. abstaining. The U.S. was directly involved. The Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean sort of pulled back so that the Israeli planes would be able to refuel without Sixth Fleet pretending not to notice them. And the United States did not warn Tunisia, an ally, that this bombing attack was coming. So that's a major act of terrorism outside, the local area of the Middle East. And there are many others. The U.S., in fact, the main act of terrorism in that year, sort of garden variety terrorism, was a car bombing in Beirut, which killed 80 people and wounded about 200, set off by the CIA, British intelligence, and Saudi intelligence in an effort to kill a Muslim cleric who they missed, but they got a lot of other people. It was a car bombing right outside a mosque, timed to go off right when everybody would be coming out, so you get maximum killing of civilians. That's there, but also not in the annals of terrorism any more than the bombing of Tunis, or, for example, the U.S. Bombing of Libya the next year, which is another act of arms aggression, but considered okay. All of this, I should say that Arab opinion in the Middle East, and here too, is very misled about all of this, in my opinion. Pretty clearly, in fact. It very consistently, you read it now or in the past, it claims that the United States overlooks Israeli terrorism because of the Jewish influence or the Jewish lobby or something like that. And this is simply untrue. It's missing the fact that there's a much more general principle that applies to this case and many others. The principle is that the United States has the right of terrorism, and that right is inherited by its clients, and it doesn't matter who they are. So Israel happens to be a U.S. client, so it inherits the right of terror. And you can see this very easily in other parts of the world, just to give one illustration from a different part of the world at the same time. At the same time, 1987, the State Department conceded what anyone paying attention knew, that the U.S. terrorist forces attacking Nicaragua were being directed, commanded and trained and directed to attack what were called soft targets, meaning defenseless civilian targets like agricultural cooperatives and health centers and so on. And they were able to do this because the U.S. had total control of the air and surveillance and was able to communicate to the local terrorist forces attacking from Honduras the position of Nicaraguan army forces so they could go somewhere else and so on. That was all conceded publicly. It didn't make much of a, nobody paid much attention except those who were interested in these things. But the human rights groups did protest. America's Watch protested against this and said this is really awful. And there was a response, an interesting response, which you should read, by Michael Kinsley, who was the kind of representative of the dovish left in mainstream commentary, still is. He had an article in which he pointed out, speaking from the dovish left, that it's perfectly true that these attacks, terrorist attacks against undefended targets, in his words, cause vast civilian suffering, but they may nevertheless be sensible and legitimate. And the way we decide this is by carrying out cost-benefit analysis. Namely, I'm quoting all through this, we have to measure the amount of blood and misery that are poured in and compare it with the outcome, democracy in our sense, meaning rule by the business world with the population crushed. And if the cost-benefit analysis comes out okay, then it's right to pour in blood and misery and cause vast suffering. In short, aggression and terror have to meet a pragmatic criterion, and we're the ones who decide whether it's met, not anybody else. And U.S. clients inherit that right. And it doesn't have to be Israel. It can be anybody else. So it can be Arabs, for example. Saddam Hussein's a striking case. In 1988, remember, Saddam Hussein was still a loyal friend and ally, and that's when he committed his worst crimes. That's the gassing of the Kurds and so on. The U.S. thought it was okay. I mean, continued to support him, downplayed it, provided him with military equipment, sent agricultural assistance, which he badly needed. The Kurds were an agricultural region, and so Iraq was in short of food, so Bush administration moved in, and that continued. In fact, Iraq, an Arab state, was actually given was allowed to do something that up until then only Israel had been allowed to do, namely attack a U.S. warship, a U.S. ship, and kill sailors. Iraq was permitted to attack the USS Stark, a destroyer, kill 37 crewmen with missiles, and didn't even get a tap on the wrist. Prior to that, that means you're really privileged if you're allowed to do that. Up until then, the only country that had been allowed to do that was Israel in 1967 in the case of the U.S. Liberty. And remember, this is an Arab state. That was important. I mean, again, nobody pays much attention here, but in the region, people paid attention. In particular, Iran paid attention. This was part of what convinced Iran to capitulate to Iraq, as the U.S. wanted. The other major event that convinced Iran that the U.S. was really serious was the shooting down of an Iranian airliner, killing 290 people by an American warship in an Iranian airspace. It wasn't even a problem. Again, it's kind of sloughed off here, not very important, but for the Iranians that was important. And they understood from these acts that the U.S. was going to go to any lengths to ensure that Saddam Hussein won, so they capitulated. Not a small point in the politics of the region. Maybe here people don't want to think about it, but elsewhere in the world they do. So I think the thing to be recognized is, contrary to a lot of the Arab commentary abroad and here, Washington, it really is an equal opportunity employer. That is, it adheres pretty well to a policy of non-discrimination in advocacy of terror and war crimes and so on. Other issues are involved, not who you are. Well, let's go back to a couple steps back further to 242. Remember, UN 242, the basic document, and the permanent settlement, according to the current process, was strictly rejectionist, nothing for the Palestinians. It was taken really seriously. There was a threat of war at the time, nuclear war, and it called for full peace in return for full withdrawal. There was deadlock. I mean, Israel refused full withdrawal. The Arab states refused full peace. That deadlock was broken in 1971 when President Sadat of Egypt, just come into office, offered to accept the official U.S. position. So he said, yeah, he'll accept full peace with Israel in return for partial withdrawal. Didn't even go as far as 242, namely withdrawal from Egyptian territory. So if Israel would withdraw from the Sinai, Sadat would agree to full peace. Didn't say anything about the Palestinians, nothing about the West Bank. Israel recognized that. It was recognized officially in response as a genuine peace offer. Rabin, in his memoirs, later calls it a famous milestone on the path to peace. Internally in Israel, it was understood that they could have peace at this point, general peace. One of the leading Labor Party officials, retired General Chaim Bar-Lev, wrote in a Labor Party journal at the time, yes, okay, with this offer, we can have full peace. So conflict's over, if we decide it's over. But I think we should refuse, because if we hold out, we can get more. This would require us to withdraw from the Sinai, and I don't think we have to. So therefore, we should hold out and abandon peace, and that's what Israel did. Its response was that it would not withdraw to the pre-June borders. Well, the U.S. was then in a dilemma. Should it continue with its official policy, which in fact it had initiated, 242, or should abandon it, and that means siding with Sadat, Egypt, against Israel, or should it abandon its policy and side with Israel against Egypt, but that means rescinding UN 242 in effect. And there was an internal conflict. The State Department was in favor of keeping to this policy. Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, wanted what he called stalemate, meaning no diplomacy, no negotiations, just force. And in the internal conflict, Kissinger won out. The U.S. effectively rescinded UN 242, which no longer exists, and people should understand that. UN 242 now means what the United States says it means, as it do other things. That's the meaning of power. It means withdrawal insofar as the U.S. and Israel determine. And that's what it's meant ever since. So when Palestinians or Arab states now complain that Israel isn't living up to UN 242, they are just choosing to ignore the historical record. And blindness is not a helpful position if you're in world affairs. You might as well have your eyes open. UN 242, since February 1971, does not exist. It exists only in the Kissingerian sense. Now here you have to be a little nuanced, because officially the U.S. continues to endorse 242 in its original sense. So you can find statements by Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, or speechwriters, and George Bush, saying, yeah, we insist on 242 in its original sense. You can't find statements by Clinton. Clinton, I think, is the first president not even having given lip service to it. But the fact is that the lip service is pure hypocrisy, because while they're adhering to it for public purposes, they are also providing Israel with the wherewithal, the funds, the military support, the diplomatic support to violate it, namely to act to integrate the occupied territories within Israel. So the endorsement of it is hypocritical, and you can, should compliment Clinton on having the honesty simply to withdraw it, in effect. Well, that brings us up to February 71. Sadat should add that Clinton has also, the United States has also blocked all other UN resolutions except for one, Resolution 194, December 11th, 1948, which calls for the right of return of refugees or compensation. That was technically endorsed by the United States, like they voted for it at the UN every year, but pure hypocrisy. They never intended to. And again, Clinton overcame the hypocrisy. He withdrew support for it. So the last vote was unanimous, with Israel and the United States opposed, and the Clinton administration also declared all other UN resolutions null and void. It will now only be the Oslo process. So that's honesty again. Sadat in 1971 made it very clear, and continued for several years to make it clear, that if the United States refused to accept a negotiated settlement, he would be forced to go to war. Nobody took him seriously. A lot of racism here. It was assumed that Arabs didn't know which end of the gun to hold and that sort of thing. Finally, war came in 1973, and it turned out to be a very close thing, and it scared everyone. There was another near nuclear confrontation, and Israel was in deep trouble for a while. And it was understood that Egypt can't just be written off. They're not just a basket case. So Kissinger moved to the fallback position, the natural fallback position, namely exclude Egypt from the conflict. It's the only Arab deterrent, so we can't just ignore it, so exclude it from the conflict. Then you get shuttle diplomacy. 1977 comes Sadat's famous trip to Jerusalem, where he was hailed as a kind of a saint for being the first Arab leader to be willing to talk to Israel. In fact, in Jerusalem, if you look at his speech, it was less forthcoming than his offer in February 71. In February 71, he offered full peace with nothing about the Palestinians. On his trip to Jerusalem, he insisted on rights for the Palestinians. But that's allowed to enter history. February 71 is out of history. I mean, you can't even find it in scholarly literature. But the trip to Jerusalem is in history because at that time the U.S. was compelled to accept the offer, whereas in February 71 it was able to reject the offer. So one is out of history, the other is in history. Sadat's a secular saint because of his trip in 1977, not because of his more forthcoming offer in February 71. Well, that goes on to Camp David, 78, 79, now under Carter, and it's considered a grand moment of the peace process. Israel did agree to withdraw from Sinai, as Egypt had offered 7 years earlier, and the U.S. at this point had no choice but to agree. The result, however, was understood very clearly in Israel. One leading Israeli analyst, military strategic analyst, Avner Yaniv, pointed out right away that the Camp David settlement eliminates the only Arab deterrent and therefore allows Israel to continue at will to integrate the occupied territories into Israel and to attack its northern neighbor, to attack Lebanon, with massive U.S. support in both cases. The Carter administration rapidly increased support to more than half of total U.S. aid overseas to make sure that these ends could be achieved. Well, while all this was going on, there was another current. The international consensus on the issue had shifted. In 1967, there was nothing for the Palestinians, no Palestinian rights. By the early 70s, that was changing. By the mid-70s, there was an extremely broad international consensus, including just about everybody, calling for Palestinian national rights alongside of Israel. It included the Russians, it included Europe, it included, Asia, Latin America, I mean, virtually everyone. That came to a head in January 1976, another very important event, crucial for understanding what's happening now, but out of history, because it tells the wrong story. You can find it, but, out of history, again, even out of scholarship. In January 1976, the United Nations Security Council considered a resolution calling for a two-state settlement. It included all the wording of UN 242, so everything about Israel's rights and so on, but it added national rights for the Palestinians in the territories that were occupied, had been occupied, from which Israel was to withdraw according to the original understanding of 242. Well, what happened to that? That resolution was actually brought by what are called the confrontation states, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. It was strongly supported by the PLO, though they may have forgotten that. In fact, I suspect they have. In fact, according to Israel's UN representative, Chaim Herzog, later president, the resolution was actually prepared by the PLO. I don't think that's likely, but that's what Israel perceived, at least. Anyhow, it was certainly supported by them and by the confrontation states, and indeed by virtually the entire world. Maybe Gaddafi didn't support it, I don't remember. But essentially the whole world supported it, and Israel and the United States had to react. Israel reacted in a typical way by bombing Lebanon. It bombed Lebanon, killing 50 people in some village that was chosen at random. That was reported here, but considered insignificant. It was retaliation against the United Nations, in effect. The United States reacted in a simpler way, namely by vetoing the resolution. So it was vetoed by Carter, and that means vetoed from history, remember. It's very common for the U.S. to veto Security Council resolutions. In fact, it's the champion in the world by a long shot. But they disappear from history as well. Carter did the same thing in 1980, same resolution. But meanwhile, the international consensus persisted. Here you can begin to understand the significance of the fact that the Declaration of Principles in September 1993 referred to UN 242 and nothing else. Because by then there was a whole raft of resolutions vetoed by the U.S. at the Security Council, but passed at the General Assembly, calling for Palestinian national rights, and they were not to be part of the permanent settlement under the U.S. version of the peace process. The General Assembly had votes year after year. I won't run through the details. But the wording varied a little bit, but they were more or less the same, kind of a two-state settlement, national rights for both groups. The votes were, 150 to 2 or something like that. Occasionally the U.S. would pick up another vote, El Salvador or somebody. But that was year by year, essentially never reported. In fact, probably never reported. The last vote was December 1990, 144 to 2, and the date is important. Shortly after that, a couple of weeks after, the United States and Britain bombed Iraq. Saddam, remember, had shifted from loyal friend and ally to reincarnation of Hitler, not because of any crimes, the crimes were fine, but because he disobeyed orders, or maybe misunderstood orders, and that's not permitted. So that's a standard transition, and therefore you had to get rid of the beast of Baghdad. Obvious where the power was, so that worked. During the bombing, George Bush announced proudly the coming of the New World Order. He defined it very simply. What we say goes, says it sort of clearly. Certainly with regard to the Middle East, the rest of the world understood that. Everybody backed off. Europe disappeared. The Third World was in disarray. Russia was gone. At this point, the U.S. could simply ram through its own extreme rejectionist position. And it did. The Madrid conference took place a few months later, and then you go straight on to Oslo. Then come successive agreements. The integration of the territories continues right through the Oslo period. The various agreements, slate, so I won't run through them, just authorize this. The U.S. funds it, it protects it diplomatically, brings us up to Camp David in the year 2000. The public discussion was about Barak's remarkable offers and, forthcoming this and that and willing to give away everything. There's absolutely no basis for any of that. There was a focus on Jerusalem, and for good reasons. Jerusalem's probably the easiest of all the problems to solve. And for Clinton and Barak, it made good sense to focus on Jerusalem because then you would divert attention away from what's important, namely what's going on in the occupied territories, the settlement, the infrastructure development, the enclaves, and so on. For Arafat, it also made good sense to focus on Jerusalem because he's desperately eager to get support from the Arab states, and the Arab states don't give a damn what happens to the Palestinians. Their populations may, but certainly not the leaders. On the other hand, they'll find it difficult to abandon control over the religious sites, because if they do that, their populations will blow up. So by focusing on the religious sites, kind of negotiating ploy for Arafat. So they all focused on that, neglecting the crucial problem, what's going on elsewhere. I have a couple of maps with me, Israeli maps, but these are final status maps, what it's supposed to look like in the long term. And what it looks like in the long term, briefly, is that what's called Jerusalem extends all the way to the Jordan River. So that splits the West Bank in two, with a substantial city, Ma'ale Adumim, in the middle and extension all the way. There's another break in the north, right through Samaria, includes towns that are settled there. Israel keeps the Jordan River. Jericho is isolated. You end up with 4 Palestinian cantons, separated from one another, separated from Jerusalem. There's some hint that in the long term, some meaningless connection will be established between them, but they're essentially completely controlled and surrounded. What's called Jerusalem extends north of Ramallah and south of Bethlehem. If you look at the map, that's a big area, and splits the northern and central and southern settlement areas into. The idea is it's kind of modeled on South Africa's policies in the early 60s. The population concentrations should be under local administration, but everything else is taken over by the dominant power, the resources, the usable land, and so on. And there's massive infrastructure developments that sort of lie behind this. The U.S. is paying for all of it, of course. That's the marvelous offer that was given. And apart from what's talked about, what actually counts, of course, is what's happening on the ground. And what's happening on the ground has been implementing this. I mean, you can't spend half a day driving through the West Bank without seeing it. It's a little harder to drive through Gaza because it's usually closed off, but essentially the same thing's happening there. And the situation is extremely serious. It was serious right through the occupation from 67 to 93. Israel was making sure, and again, when I say Israel, I mean the United States, was making sure that there would be no development in the occupied territories. Right after 1993, when Israeli journalists who had covered the territories were finally able to go to Jordan, they were shocked by what they saw. I mean, Jordan is, and they wrote about it, Hebrew Press. Jordan's a poor country. You know, Israel's a rich country. Before the 67 war, the populations in the West Bank and Palestinian populations were pretty comparable. In fact, more developed in the West Bank. By 1993, it was totally different. In the poor country, Jordan, there were agricultural development, universities, schools, roads, health services, all sorts of things. In the West Bank, there was essentially nothing. Just people could survive by remittances from abroad or by doing the dirty work in Israel, but no development was allowed. And that was very shocking to Israeli reporters, and it's also backed up in the statistics. The main work, the most important work on this topic, if you want to learn about it, is by Sarah Roy, who's a researcher at Harvard, spent an awful lot of time in the Gaza Strip. She, just to give you a couple of her figures, current ones, in 1993, electric power usage in the West Bank and Gaza was 2/3 that of Egypt, half that of Jordan. And those are poor countries, remember. Israel's a rich country. Sanitation and housing in the West Bank and Gaza was about 25% for Palestinians, 50% in Egypt for the population, and 100% in Jordan. And the figures run through that way. GDP per capita and consumption per capita declined about, and then it got worse. After 1993, it's gotten worse. So GDP per capita and consumption per capita have dropped, according to her, about 15% in the West Bank and Gaza since 93. That's even with large foreign assistance pouring in from Europe mostly. It's gotten worse in other respects. Up until 1993, the U.S. and Israel permitted humanitarian aid to come into the territories. UN humanitarian aid was permitted into the West Bank and Gaza. In 1993, that was restricted. This is part of the peace process. After Oslo, heavy customs duties were imposed. Lots of other restrictions were imposed, various kinds of harassment. Now it's blocked. Right now, humanitarian aid is blocked. The UN is protesting, but it doesn't matter. If the UN protests the blocking of humanitarian aid and it doesn't register here, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't register here because it's not reported. So they can say, the Israelis are stopping humanitarian aid from coming in, and people are starving and so on. But what does it matter? As long as people in the United States don't know about it. They can know in the Middle East, they can know in Europe, but that makes no difference. These are our choices again. For the Palestinians themselves, they're under a dual repression, very much like the Bantustans again. The repression of Israel and the United States, and then the repression of the local mercenaries who do the work for the foreigner, and enrich themselves. It's again a standard colonial pattern. Anyone who's ever taken a look at the Third World sees it. As for the goals of Oslo, they were stated very neatly by one of the leading Israeli doves, who's now the Minister of Security in the Barak government and the temporary foreign minister known as an academic dove, Shlomo Bar Ami, in an academic book, 1998, so before he got into the government, he described the goals of Oslo as to impose what he called a permanent neo-colonialist dependency in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's pretty much accurate. That's what the U.S. has been aiming at through this period, through the peace process period. As for the population, It's kind of hard to improve on a description by Moshe Dayan about 30 years ago. He was in the Labor Party, and among the Labor Party leaders, he was one of those most noted for his sympathetic attitude towards Palestinians, and also his realism. And he described what Israeli policy ought to be, U.S. policy as well. He said the Palestinians should live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we'll see where this leads. Yeah, reasonable policy, and that's U.S. policy as well, and it'll continue that way as long as we agree to permit it. Finished.
For the questions today, please come line up at the mics. Make a question very short and concise, and we hope that everyone gets a chance to ask a question. Thank you.
Roger?
Roger Leishner, Radio Free Maine. Back in 1988, up in Maine, the Maine Democratic Party and their platform adopted a plan recognizing Palestinian statehood. Now, this was a result of the Jesse Jackson campaign, and it was the only state in the nation that the Democratic Party did that in. 2 years later, AIPAC came into Maine and just worked their buns off to repeal that part of the platform. Now, it's funny that within the last 5 years, I haven't heard much about AIPAC. Has it sort of gone out of style, or has the fundamentalism in Israel sort of driven it maybe into the peace camp?
Well, first of all, I think, let me make a suggestion, and that is there's a very strong temptation, in fact, we're trained for it from infancy, to sort of project problems somewhere else. You know, somebody else is a bad guy, we're not doing it. The fundamentalism isn't in Israel, it's here. Most of the problems are here. It's easy to blame somebody else, but it's harder to look into the mirror, and that's what you ought to do. AIPAC is less visible than it was before, but that's because the Clinton administration has moved so far to the extremist end. In fact, when Clinton came in, the Israeli, the early first year or two, the Israeli press was amazed. They said, for the first time, we've got an American president who is to the extremist side of our own extremist parties. In fact, they started joking about him as the last Zionist and stuff like that. As U.S. policy has drifted towards a more extremist position, AIPAC it's still there, that's what it did before, but it doesn't have to be as visible because it's, maybe we're certainly right in the mainstream of the Democratic Party. As far as the main proposal, the one you mentioned in '87, that's right in the mainstream of American opinion. I mean, polls have been showing for years that, roughly 60 or 70% of the population supports Palestinian state. Now, one of the great failures, in my view, crimes of the PLO, and there are many, is to fail to make any effort to make use of this fact. I can run through the history if you want, but plenty of people here, a number of people here, who were sympathetic to the Palestinians but didn't think much of the PLO, and I'm one of them, were trying to convince them for years that they should try to do what every other third world movement does, namely help support some kind of popular solidarity movement, which will make use of the fact that most of the people support them anyway, even without knowing anything. And they flatly refused. They don't have anything to do with it. They acted in such a way as to make it as hard as possible to build up solidarity movements. As a result, that's one of the reasons why these things have happened. As I say, there's plenty of blame to go around. In this case, the state of Maine's position was consistent with polls throughout the country, but of course not with policy.
Wait a minute.
Let's just switch up and back between the mics.
I have two quick questions. One of them is not necessarily related to the Palestinian issue, but I was just curious because I noticed you mentioned like then Soviet Union a few times in your talk as Russia. Is that a particular reason why you use Russia as opposed to Soviet Union then? But the second question also was in regard to U.S. support of Israel, and you say that United States supports Israel because Israel is a client state, which I agree with that, and you disagreed with some thinking particularly from maybe Arab world or Middle East region, I guess, that support of Israel is due to what Jewish lobbying here in the United States, and you so disagreed with that, and I was really interested in that, why you disagree, because, well, we see so many examples of that. The latest thing was Hillary Clinton, for example.
Latest thing? Hillary
Clinton in New York rejecting some money from, some Arab groups, there are so many different examples, but I was just interested in more.
Yeah. Well, the reason why, during the period when, right now, there's no Soviet Union. Okay, that collapsed 10 years ago. So now there's the Russian Federation, if you want to use the technical term. During the period when the Soviet Union existed, it was run by Russia. So you can call it Russia or you can call it the Soviet Union. It doesn't matter very much. As far as the Jewish lobby is concerned, well, I gave one reason. I was talking about the very common claim in the Arab world and, in fact, in writings of American Arabs, namely believing that the U.S. permits Israeli atrocities because of the influence of the Jewish lobby, and I think that's just a flat-out error. I think if you look more broadly, you see that there's nothing unusual about this. Same thing happens elsewhere. The U.S. has, in fact, happily tolerated worse atrocities by Arabs, like Saddam Hussein, without any Jewish lobby. This is a misunderstanding of the nature of terror and aggression. As far as other things are concerned, yeah, there's a Jewish lobby, there's domestic lobbies on all sorts of things. But I think it misunderstands American politics to think that domestic lobbies based on communities have all that much influence. They can have a swing influence. Like if there's an issue on which the main centers of power in the business world don't care very much, like should you recognize the Armenian Holocaust or not, then yeah, domestic lobbies can make a difference. But when there's an issue on which the business world is united, they don't make much difference. And the case of Israel is kind of interesting because here's a case where the real powers in the country have in fact been split for the last 30 years. There's been a divide. So there's been a sector of power in the United States which is an important sector, and with regard to the Middle East, a very important sector, namely the energy corporations, which have more or less favored the international consensus. And they oppose state policy on other things too. So like they would like to have a reconciliation with Iran, and they're opposed to the fact that the government won't allow it. And similarly on Iraq. On the other hand, there's other sectors of power, big sectors of power, which have gone the other way. And in this kind of a context, it's possible that a swing factor can work. But I don't think it's the Jewish lobby. The Jewish lobby is part of it. But after 1967, there was just a love affair with Israel on the part of a large sector of the elite American population. American intellectuals, for example, just fell in love with Israel. You can see this very easily just by looking at the coverage in even left journals. Let's say Dissent, Social Democratic Journal. It's a good. Up until 1967, they didn't care about Israel one way or another. In fact, the New York Times wasn't all that pro-Israel. It wasn't, in fact. It was non-Zionist, Jewish-owned, but non-Zionist. Commentary Magazine, which is now kind of like a rabid, ultra-Zionist journal, back in the 1950s was so critical of Israel that the American Zionist organization actually set up a competitor called Midstream to sort of represent the Israeli point of view. All of this stuff changed in 1967, and it changed because of Israel's military victory, which won them a lot of points. For one thing, they were giving a great gift to American power. For another, the other is a little more subtle maybe, but you have to remember what was happening in the United States at that time. The United States was fighting a war in Vietnam, and it was not succeeding in crushing the South Vietnamese, who were the main target of the attack. Despite what they now claim, educated Americans, the educated population, the elite population, pretty much across the spectrum, was pro-war and very upset by the fact that the U.S. wasn't winning. Many had what they call pragmatic objections, like Kinsley, it's costing too much or something. But fundamentally, they supported the war, and that continued until 1968, when the business community turned against it. And then later, intellectuals turned against it. But Israel was showing how you deal with third world upstarts properly. You kick them in the face, and they won a lot of points for that. In fact, those of you who are old enough to remember will recall that the jokes about let's send Moshe Dayan to Vietnam and he'll show us how to do it right. That, among other things, led to a quite substantial shift of opinion in the articulate sectors of American society, including the media. And that gave it, starting from then, there was quite a different picture. And there were other sources. So, for example, one of the main sources of support for Israel in the United States is a very powerful group, namely Christian fundamentalists. They're a huge part of the population, way beyond the Jewish population. I mean, about 40% of the population. This is one of the most fundamentalist countries in the world, more than Iran. Like around 40% of the population call themselves born-again Christians. And every political candidate has to pretend to be some kind of born-again Christian, otherwise you can't run. And that's a very substantial group of people, and there's a big sector of that which is very, what they call pro-Israel. I mean, they may be anti-Semitic, they probably are, but they're very supportive of Israel. And the reasons are all kind of complicated things about the Book of Revelations, and I won't go into that. But that's a big support group. There are others. So yeah, there's a Jewish lobby, undoubtedly, and it has an effect in things that don't matter very much. But when it comes to a crunch, I think you see that it doesn't have that much power. So when there have been occasions where there was really a conflict between Israel and the United States. There haven't been a lot, but there have been a few such occasions, and it's interesting to see what happens to the lobby. So one such occasion, striking one, was in 1956, when Israel invaded Egypt along with France and England. And the U.S. was opposed to that, not because it had any objection to invading Egypt, but Israel had the wrong allies. Those are the guys we're trying to kick out of the Middle East, France and England, and they're trying to reinsert themselves. The timing, Eisenhower didn't like. This was right before the election, 1956 election, the most sensitive moment in political life. Eisenhower just told Israel to get out, period. Okay? Said, you get out or else. And Israel got out, of course. The lobby disappeared. No protest from the lobby. Another event like that, minor event, happened just a couple of years ago in 1991, when there was a confrontation between Shamir, who was then Prime Minister, and George Bush over the style of settlement. It had nothing to do with substance, but over the style of settlement in the occupied territories. Shamir comes from, there's a westernized section in Israel. It's mainly the Labor Party. The Labor Party is educated professionals, Western-oriented, secular, that sort of thing. And they understand how you deal with the West. They understand the norms of Western hypocrisy. There's another sector which is poor, religious, the Arab Jewish population, Sephardic Jews and so on. They don't understand much about the West. Shamir and Likud generally comes from them. That's why the U.S. typically prefers the Labor Party. They do about the same things, but the style is different. And that showed at that time. So right at that moment, every time James Baker, Secretary of State, would show up in Israel, the settlers would pick that moment, to go up to a hill somewhere and put up a sign saying new settlement and saying, some vulgar expression about Baker, and we don't care what you say. And the U.S. didn't like that. That's not the way you're supposed to behave. The way you're supposed to behave is the way Shimon Peres would do it. So you wait until a week after Baker goes home, and then you don't go up and put up a new settlement. You thicken an old settlement doing exactly the same thing, and you don't offend the boss, and everybody's happy. The boss continues to pay. That's fundamentally the difference in the Labour Party and Likud. And Bush and Baker were annoyed enough at this so that Bush threatened to withhold loan guarantees, which were being used illegally by Israel to build settlements. Israel was very much upset about that. There's a lot of money at stake. The lobby at first protested, but Bush made, one speech on television, which he didn't say very much. He just a couple of hints that this wasn't going to work, and the lobby just vanished, and Israel backed off. And this just happened a couple of months ago. The Israeli government was deeply committed. A big project of theirs was selling advanced military technology to China. And they have mostly a military industry. It's kind of military-based economy. It's kind of like the United States in many ways, sort of an offshoot. And a large part of the economy is military-based. And for their purposes, these advanced technology sales to China were extremely important. And the U.S. was opposed to it. Barack insisted publicly in Israel he was going to do it. He didn't care what the United States thought. But the Clinton administration just told him, sorry, that's not going to work. And of course, they had to back off on a matter very critical to them, and the lobby was not in evidence. And I think you find that in case after case. If the lobby sees that it's running up against real power, it's going to disappear. For one thing, because they're cowards, and for another thing, because they don't have that much power. Yeah.
I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the issue of Jerusalem. You already mentioned that has been used to diverge the attention for what's going on in the settlements and with the infrastructure in the territories, but it seems that in some way the peace process always falls back on Jerusalem. In the Oslo Agreement was treated separately from the rest. The present Intifada started from something happening in Jerusalem, or it was used as a focus because, as you were saying, the holy sites are there, and major interventions are happening on the physical form of the city, and this is upsetting the situation. So what do you think will be the role of Jerusalem in the peace process?
Well, first of all, we have to be careful about what we mean by Jerusalem. If you mean Jerusalem in the pre-1967 sense, okay, that's a small area. I mean, the first thing Israel did after the 67 war was to approximately tripled the size of Jerusalem very quickly, both into the West Bank and also into Israel proper. Israel semi-annexed Jerusalem. Technically speaking, it was careful not to annex it because it knew that would lead to an international protest. But it's called annexation, and in practice it's kind of like that. So they tripled the area, and they more or less annexed it, but not formally. And they didn't do it in a very polite fashion either. So it's recently been revealed in Israel, only in the last couple of months, that when they came in, they smashed up a Palestinian housing area right in front of what's called the Wailing Wall, the western wall of the temple. And they barely warned the residents, and it turns out that the bulldozers apparently bulldozed people right into the houses as they smashed it down. But they basically took over a large part of the city. That's expanded Jerusalem. Now then it goes on. There's also something called Greater Jerusalem, which is a big ring, around it, which is intended to incorporate the city that I mentioned, Ma'ale Adumim, which itself its borders go to about 8 kilometers from Jericho. Most of these settlements only use a tiny fraction of the territory that's assigned to them. So Ma'ale Adumim, for example, which is the most important because it splits the West Bank in two, east of Jerusalem, that uses about 1/16 of the land assigned to it, either in housing or agriculture. That means they're intended to expand. Well, when, say, Rabin talked about Greater Jerusalem, that's what he's talking about. Now, so to distinguish the issue of Jerusalem from that of the territories is not really very easy, because Jerusalem, what's called, Greater Jerusalem, is a big piece of the territories. In fact, it effectively splits the West Bank in two. one of the salients. There's another one further north, and there are a couple others. If you talk about Jerusalem proper, like the religious sites, in the old city and that sort of thing, that's not a hard problem. One very good Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kimmerling, very smart guy, Hebrew University, he had an article a couple of weeks ago in which he said, look, the issue of Jerusalem is a diversion. He says, this is the easiest. We could solve this one in 5 minutes, he said. Okay, it's a bit of an exaggeration, not quite 5 minutes. But it's easy to figure out technical answers to the problem of Jerusalem if anybody wants to bother. Like the holy sites can be under some kind of international supervision, and the what's left of the Palestinian residential areas can be Palestinian administered, which if Israel's sensible, they'd prefer anyway. And a couple other things like that. It's really a kind of small technical problem. What cannot be finessed, however, is the takeover of the territories. That you can't finesse. Either they get out, or it's Bantustans. Those are the choices. And although you're right that this intifada happened to start in Jerusalem, that's pretty misleading. I mean, it's been mostly in Gaza and around Ramallah and places like that, which is typical. The same was true of the last intifada. Does everybody know this story already, or do we have to sit here and listen to it?
The story is that what we think is that U.S. imperialism has to be overthrown through workers' revolution, as opposed to you who offers criticism to the U.S. diplomacy.
For those of you who aren't familiar with this is a routine that goes on at every meeting. Let me just ask you, how many people want to listen to this? Will the people who want to listen to this raise their hands? Okay, will the people who want to go on with the discussion raise their hands? Okay.
Why are you against democratic discussion?
I just gave you a democratic vote.
I mean, you can manufacture your own consent.
Yeah, right. This is a standard routine of harassment and effort to break up meetings that goes on all the time. Okay. Look, you set up a meeting, you're free to set it up, everybody can come. Let's go on. Yeah. We had a popular vote. We've heard it already. Let's go on.
I just thought there were a few facts that you didn't mention, and I wonder why. For instance, if I go back to the '67 war, it's a fact that Israel was attacked. It was a self-defense war, and it wasn't mentioned. If we're talking about the Lebanon war, I mean, the life of the Israeli who lived in the Galilee were hell for years. Attacks and children in shelters, children murdered at schools, you didn't mention it. And recent things, like the killing in Gaza, which I'm against violence, and I don't justify any kind of violence, but the Gaza event in Netzarim, you didn't mention, and it happened 1 month ago. The school bus of Israeli children who went to school who was bombed by Palestinians, and this created the reaction. You didn't also mention what happened after the prayer. I think it's a mistake to bring so many policemen when people go out from the mosque. But what really started, and I read it in the newspaper because I live here right now. It was when the Arabs finished praying, they just throw stones on the Jews who were praying downstairs on the west wall. I mean, you didn't even mention. I don't think that violence is justified, but I think that also the Jews in Israel have the right not to be murdered and not to live in shelters and not to live there. I remember myself in shelters so many years. I mean, all these events were not mentioned by you, even by a hint, and this is what bothers me.
Okay, well, you're absolutely right. I didn't mention the atrocities committed against Jews, and I didn't mention the vastly worse atrocities committed against Arabs. Like in discussing this current intifada, I said I've heard nothing about the atrocities. So you're right. I didn't mention the few cases in which atrocities were committed against Jews, or the many cases in which atrocities were committed against Arabs. And the same in the past. I barely mentioned them because I was talking about other things. However, and we could, but then we'll balance it. I mean, for example, it is simply not a fact that the Palestinians coming out of the mosque started throwing stones on the down below. And if you read Haaretz, you'll see that it's not a fact. That happened after the border guards were shooting.
Was the killing of the children who went to school in Netzarim, is it a true
yes,
fact
it was.
or not?
That is a true fact, as was
so why did you choose among these two facts just to mention the fact that people were killed by the American helicopters, and you didn't mention the children who were murdered on their way to school?
For a simple reason, because the overwhelming mass of the atrocities are by Israel and the United States. I am talking about the United States and our supply of military helicopters. If we were providing guns to the Palestinians to kill Israelis, and the Palestinians were carrying out 90% of the atrocities, I'd talk about that. But I'm talking about our providing military helicopters to the Israelis to carry out 90% of the atrocities against Israel. That's why I mentioned it, but barely. Barely. But may I continue?
Sure,
I let you talk. Let's go back to 1967 and 1982. In 1967, Israel was not attacked, and nobody even pretends that. I mean, back at the time, Abba Eban, it was his job at the UN to claim that Israel was attacked. He knew it was a lie, and what he was saying was total lies. And you can't even get this in Israeli...
Was Israel attacked in 73? In 72?
You want to go back to that? Let's take a look at 67. I'll come then next to 73. In 67, Israel launched the war. Now, you could say it was a legitimate preemptive strike, if you like, but there is just no question that Israel attacked. Okay? That is not even a matter of debate. As for 1973, no, Israel was not attacked. What was attacked was Israeli-occupied territory. Egypt attacked Egyptian territory that was held by Israel under the conditions that I described, after Israel refused a peace treaty. And the fact of the matter is there is not one case in which Israel was attacked. In 1982, you've got your dates mixed up. There was a time when people were hiding in the Galilee, but not in 1981. In 1981 was an extremely peaceful year. There were no attacks from the north to the south, zero.
I lived in this area
in 1981. In 1981,
in the 80s, children were sitting in shelters.
That is after
weekend.
Right.
And you couldn't change the
May
fact.
I continue?
Also, Birzeit University and all the media, the CNN are in the territories, and you get all the information through the media. And you say there is no university, no media, no attacks on Israelis. We were in the shelters, and you stand here and said that there were no shelters, no attacks from Lebanon territories.
No, I didn't say that. I said in 1981, up until the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, there were no attacks from the north. There were plenty of attacks from the south. Israel was regularly bombing Lebanon, trying to elicit some kind of PLO response, which would be a justification for the planned invasion. And they were bombing fishing boats, they were attacking villages, they were killing all sorts of people. There was nothing in response. Israel attacked in 1982, and they were pretty frank about it, because they were afraid of PLO moderation. They were afraid that the PLO was abandoning terrorism and was moving towards a political settlement, and that's what Israel does not want. They made it pretty clear. Like, if you were there at the time and you were reading the papers, you would have read it. Like in a couple of weeks right after the invasion, Yehoshua Porat, who's, I'm sure you know, the leading Israeli, pretty conservative guy, incidentally, but the leading Israeli academic expert on the Palestinians, wrote an article in Haaretz in which he pointed out that we had to invade Lebanon because what was happening was what he called a veritable catastrophe. The PLO was refusing to carry out terrorist acts. They were becoming a kind of a moderate force. For Israel, this is impossible. We want them to go back to terrorism. And Israel tried to elicit terrorism. Now, take a look at what happened after that. I mean, if you want, I'll direct you to Israeli sources. But right after that period, what was happening was regularly, Israel was provoking attacks inside Lebanon. And when they would bomb somewhere in Lebanon, there would be a response in which Kiryat Shmona would get a Katyusha attack. That was happening consistently, and in fact, it mostly happened after 1982.
Now, why
may I
there
continue?
is attacks now when Israel already withdrew? It's not true.
Israel,
in the 80s, we were in the shelters. You read only the articles that serve your point.
No,
but
I don't.
Now, are there now attacks on Israel when Israel withdrew from from Lebanon?
So we agree, I presume, that everything you've said so far is false. And now let's look to the present. When Israel withdrew from Lebanon, let's take a look at the present case. Finally, Israel withdrew after 22 years of illegal occupation in which it killed about 45,000 people, kind of triviality.
Nobody, of course, from the Israeli part.
A few dozen were killed in Israel.
One or two?
A few dozen, counted up. In almost every case was retaliation for an Israeli attack in Lebanon. The standard cycle, there was a standard cycle that happened over and over. It's very well documented. The Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, the occupying forces in southern Lebanon, or their mercenary army, the SLA, would be attacked by the resistance, Hezbollah, and then Israel would retaliate by bombing northern, Beirut or, some refugee camp and so on, and then Hezbollah would send rockets to northern Israel. That was the regular cycle, almost invariant. And in fact, that cycle began in an interesting way. It began in 1992. Up until from 1981 right through 1992, there was almost nothing except Israeli attacks in Lebanon, of which there were numerous ones. Like Shimon Peres's 1985 Iron Fist operations right in the middle of Lebanon were murderous. And they were well reported in the Israeli press, but there was almost no retaliation. In 1992, something changed. And it was described very accurately, for example, by Moshe Arendt, nice right-wing Minister of Defense. You don't have to worry about his politics. He explained that in 1992, the rules of the game changed. How did they change? Well, Israel had carried out an assassination of a Shiite cleric, and they killed him and his wife and child, and then bombed an ambulance that was trying to come pick him up. They said, well, okay, that changed the rules of the game. From now on, after this period, in fact, what happened is that what I just described, the cycle that after Hezbollah attacks on Israeli forces or their mercenary army, Israel would respond farther north, killing people, and then after 92, Hezbollah would also attack northern Israel. Now, if you go back to the early 70s, what you're describing is at least partially true. But after that, it's simply not true.
The Lebanon war, which I objected, was a reaction
I'm sorry.
to the terrorist attack.
I'm sorry. These questions are very important.
It's a very important question. If you like, I'll be glad to give you, the highest level Israeli sources which discuss and describe the Lebanon war. What you're hearing is probably propaganda that you learned in elementary school. Nobody believes this in the Israeli academic system. This is not true. I mean, the Lebanon war was a straight attack. Nothing had been happening except attacks from Israel to Lebanon for over a year.
We can only take two more questions, please. We will have to leave the hall
in about
10 minutes. Please keep it concise, and we'll hope to answer. Thank you.
You had mentioned many events that didn't make it into the U.S. Mainstream press. And I was wondering if you could suggest some sources where someone in the U.S. could find out about those kind of things.
Well, everything I've just, almost, not everything, but most of what I've just said is you can pick up off the web if you want. I mean, a lot of this I've written about in the last the current stuff I've written about in the last few months. The earlier stuff is in a long series of books. I've been writing about it since 1970 as the situation developed, just writing about it, and so have others.
But I'm just curious, where could I look now to be better informed?
Well, you get a lot of material from a lot of the Hebrew press is now available in English. So you can pick up a lot from, if you read good Israeli journalists like Amir Haas and Gideon Levy, unfortunately he's not well, so he's not writing, but Danny Rubenstein, a couple of others, and you can pick them up off the web from the Haaretz English edition. You get a lot of material. There are a lot of Palestinian sources. There are international sources. Read Robert Fisk, British journalist in the London Independent, and others, and you get quite good information. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have had things. And there are many other people who write about this. I'm not the only one. But you're going to have to work. For example, on the one, I mean, I could have given 1,000 cases, but on the few cases that I mentioned, you know, the suppression of the diplomatic record, the current business with the helicopters, you can find it, but you're going to have to search. The Boston Globe isn't going to report it. In fact, they made it very clear they're not going to report it.
Are there some foreign sources, foreign press that reports those kind of things?
Yeah, for example, the helicopters was discussed in the British press by a few journalists and in the continental press. I mean, I don't want to suggest it's all that different, but it's somewhat more open. On the other hand, you're going to have to work. If you're on the internet and you look up ZNet, you're going to find almost all of this stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Noam. Having recently returned from both Gaza and the West Bank and seen these helicopters in action and seen sharpshooters, Israeli sharpshooters in action killing kids, and by the way, this is reported in Haaretz, the main Israeli paper, but it's not reported here. I returned with this incredible sense of frustration, how to get the word out. I mean, it's this such a pall of silence here that we have to somehow be able to break. And I've talked there with people, you know, how can the international community somehow be mobilized to try to help break this silence? And we've discussed having an international presence, you know, which might command some kind of media attention if it can be large enough. One of the problems being people there cannot demonstrate any other way now except by taking rocks and having guns, because they will be shot down and killed if they are simply there demonstrating the way we do here, forms of civil protest. But they thought if we could get a large international presence to come and stand with them, maybe outside of settlements and so on, we could be some form of protection. I'd like your comment on that. And also one other thing I heard in Israel among the peace camp, which is being, in my view, you know, the silence that reigns from that peace camp is very, very depressing. But I did have people say, well, now that George Bush is going to be president, this was a couple weeks ago, but they knew, things will be all right, because he will put this matter on the back burner, and America won't be so hands-on in its involvement. And if you could comment on that, too, I'd be grateful.
Well, direct involvement is a great thing, but you know, it's extremely hard. There is direct involvement in Hebron, for example. There's a small Christian peacekeeper group in Hebron, which, since they're Christian Americans, the Israeli forces aren't going to kill them, you know, so they kind of leave them alone. And they publish regular reports. In fact, one of the ways whoever it was asking for information. Their reports keep coming back from Hebron, but again, you got to get them on the internet. But, you know, they've had some effect. You know, like the presence of some Americans tends to cut down the level of violence because, for the same reason I mentioned at the beginning, neither the United States nor Israel wants the terror to be too visible. Now, the same was true in Central America, incidentally. That was a real breakthrough in the history of imperialism, and we should be aware of it. In Central America in the 1980s, when the U.S. was carrying out a murderous war, primarily against the Catholic Church, in fact, but of course peasants were the ones who were mostly killed. For the first time ever in history, as far as I know, North Americans went down there to live in villages in the hope that a white face would cut down the level of terror, because they wouldn't want to murder people as visibly if there's North Americans around. Actually, they were coming from, a lot of them came from Christian fundamentalist groups. This is not coming from the left particularly. Witnesses for Peace, for example. That's an astonishing achievement. It's one of the most important events in the history of, that never happened in the history of imperialism. Britain, France, U.S. and Vietnam, anything you can think of. And that was important, and it had an effect. But you have to think what the commitment is. I mean, you have to be willing to live like a third world person, right? It's not so simple, I mean, you can do it, and they live like that, but that doesn't mean it's easy for us to live like that. We're used to a different level of privilege. And you're facing constant danger, and you're giving up the rest of your life. Yeah, it can be done, and it's extremely important, but it's going to be small scale. There is something much more important to do, which we can do right here, and that is break the silence here. You know, this has been done on issue after issue. I'm talking about the Middle East. It was exactly the same on Vietnam. It's the same on El Salvador. It's the same on Colombia right now. It's the same on Turkey. You know, you can run through the list of cases. A to Z is always the same. And it takes a lot of effort and organization and educational works and dedication, you know, to try to break through this. And over the years, you can do it. It is not easy. I mean, just to mention one case which finally hit the headlines, East Timor. I mean, I myself was working on that for 25 years, you know, very hard, writing about it, you know, speaking all over the place. So were a couple other people, so few that I could name them if you want. And this went on almost with no effect, you know, until finally there was actually one very good guy, Charlie Shiner, managed to use the internet to carry out organization, which worked very effectively. Pretty soon there were organizations around and it broke through and so on. This is really hard work, no matter what the issue. And it doesn't happen just like that. You know, you got to devote yourself to it. A lot of time and energy. There are no magic keys. You just got to keep at it. And it's got to be done here. If it's not done here, it doesn't matter what the international opinion is. I mean, you know, Europe is marginal in this issue, most issues. The rest of the world can talk if they want, but the U.S. isn't paying much attention and won't unless they are disruptive. But right here, there's a lot that you can do. Here's the source of power. Here's where we are. We're privileged. That gives us an enormous range of things that we can do, but it, you know, it doesn't come cheap. You got to devote yourself to it. As far as the peace camp in Israel is concerned, well, I don't have to tell you, but that term is used rather loosely. A lot of the people in the peace camp are kind of like American liberals. They want the Israeli occupation to work quietly without killing too many people. That's called the peace camp. I mean, I read a journal like, say, Israel Horizon, which is the publication of the M.I.T party in the United States. M.I.T is the kind of, you know, end of the extreme dovish party. I just happened to look at their last issue a couple of days ago. I mean, it's the peace camp in the sense that the New York Times was the peace camp in Vietnam in 1969. You know, it's getting out of hand. It's too bloody. I mean, they deny everything that's happening, you know, and so on. We're very familiar with this. There are people who are authentically committed to justice, you know, and yeah, they would easily fit in this auditorium. And it's not all that different here or in other countries.
Breaking the silence. And what do you recommend in specific issues? What can be done to break the silence? From your lecture, you were talking about the important role of the army, of the U.S. taxpayer money that's going towards the military. Is there anything that can be done about it? Or is it a waste of time?
No, it's not a waste of time.
The other thing is the media. You talked about talking, and your talks have been very important to spread the news, but maybe there's some other strategy to tackle the media, to spread the word. And thirdly, what do you think about type of grassroots activism and how it's going to be mobilized into something effective? Because grassroots mobilization has been there for many years. The core issue is how do you get the voice heard?
Well, actually, the grassroots activism on this issue has not been here. I mean, I've also, Nancy has too, and others, been trying for 35 years to try to get some grassroots activism on this issue, and it has been very slim. As compared with other issues, virtually invisible, and as I mentioned in passing, the PLO has a lot to answer for in this respect, but the main problem is here. So grassroots activism is crucial, but it has to be started, and there's very little of it. As for the media, they know exactly what they're doing, you know. They understand what they're doing when they don't report that the U.S. is providing more advanced military attack helicopters to Israel right at the moment when they're being used to attack civilians. They understand that. I mean, I could tell you personal examples of meetings with editors, if you like, but they understand that. We don't have to tell them. The way that they will begin to report it is if they are under pressure. But now we're back to grassroots activism and alternative media and things like that. Yeah, then they'll start to report things. Also, there are people inside the media who would like to tell the truth about it and can't because they need the backing of popular activism. It's kind of a reciprocal relationship on a lot of these issues. If something gets reported, it helps organize. If there's organization, it helps people report what they know. A journalist can't expect to go too far and stay on. It goes a little bit out of the required doctrinal limits, he'll be out, just like an academic for that matter in most fields. It's not all that different. But that's got to be the source of the work. I don't really, there's never been another way to do it on any issue. And now on the military aid, I think that's a point where you can really have an effect. I mean, most of the population, overwhelmingly, is opposed to giving military aid to Israel. But they have to know about it. Unless people know the kind of thing I was telling you, unless there's more than one opinion piece in the Raleigh, North Carolina paper in the whole country, which is an astonishing degree of discipline if you think about it. That degree of discipline, to be able to suppress crucial news like that everywhere in the country, that's a real tribute to the intellectual community. Stalin would have been impressed by that. But unless that kind of thing can be broken, there isn't any hope. But on that issue, we have an open door. If people know that their taxes are going to send advanced attack helicopters to attack civilians, they're going to raise a riot. But they got to know. And in fact, the provision of military aid is one of the, I think it's a point that really ought to be at the focus of protest. This isn't a matter of doing anything hard. It's just a matter of withdrawing participation. It's withdrawing participation in atrocities. And that would have a tremendous effect, And very hard to resist, I think, if the news ever got out, which is why it's so suppressed. The same on the whole diplomatic record. It's suppressed because if it ever gets out, people are going to be enraged. But it has to get out, and now we're back to grassroots activism. There's no other way than anybody's figured out. Actually, the availability of the internet gives a lot of options that weren't around before, and can be used pretty constructively, and is. There's an awful lot of information about these things going on around the few websites, including a lot of stuff from the Israeli press and from Palestinian sources, and from international sources, like, for example, Bob Fisk, the guy I mentioned. And that material is very instructive.
I'm afraid we actually have to close the
okay. Well, why don't we just finish these two?
If you can be very, very quick, without making a comment, I think we can accommodate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
That you talked quite extensively about the U.S. interest in the conflict, but you didn't really mention why Israel is still refusing the peace process. And refusing to give back the occupied territories, because the two reasons that are usually given for this is, first, a strategic military reason, but if you consider the gap between Israel military forces and its neighbors, it
they
doesn't
know there's no
really
security
stand.
reason.
And the other is usually the question of water, but the United Nations just issued 2 weeks ago a report stating that giving access to water to everybody in the world would cost about the same as the ice cream budget of the European Union for 1 year.
That's
what's
true, but
the real
meaningless.
reason?
It's true, but meaningless. You could say the same about, the cost of curing AIDS all over the world would be, you wouldn't even notice it. Great powers don't behave like that. First of all, it's not true that U.S. is refusing the peace process. The U.S. has accepted, Israel has accepted the peace process as defined by the United States. You cannot accuse Israel of violating the Oslo Accords. They have not. They've lived up to the Oslo Accords, which were designed in order to allow them to do exactly what they're doing. And that's a U.S. policy. Okay? Now, why doesn't Israel want to... just ask, how do they settle people in the territory? Are you Israeli? No. Well, if you want to know how they settle people in the territories, you should read the Israeli press. These people are subsidized. They live better than people in, much better than people in the main settlements areas. They have come-on ads. These are like, a lot of the West Bank is essentially suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's like people here who live in the western suburbs. I suppose you told people here, look, why don't you give up the western suburbs like, Lincoln, Lexington, Concord, give it back to the Indians. It wouldn't cost you much. There's plenty of places to live in downtown Boston. Would anybody take it seriously? It doesn't have anything to do with strategic interests or anything else. You have something, you got something that you want by force, and you're going to keep it. Okay, unless you're forced not to keep it. There's nothing special about Israel. We'd say the same thing right here. How much money would it take to turn downtown, say Roxbury, into a livable place? So little that we wouldn't even notice it on our tax bills. Is anybody going to do it? No, that means giving up something. If you're a rich, privileged person and you've gotten something ultimately by force, you just don't give it up unless you're forced to. That's the story. We're very familiar with it. We don't have to speculate about Israel. Wherever you come from, I'm sure it's true in your hometown.
But wouldn't the fruits of peace be more important than just these territories for Israel in general?
Important in what respect?
Just in terms of wealth or anything.
Well, you could say the same. Well, what is the advantage to Americans, you and me, people here, of spending, about, half of the disposable part of the budget on the military? Wouldn't we be better off if we didn't do that and we put it into medical care? Well, who'd be better off? People who get medical care would be better off, but the computer industry wouldn't be better off. These things are done for reasons, They're not done, policies are not undertaken because they benefit the population. That's why you don't have elections in which people participate. We just went through a kind of what's called an election. But if you look closely, there were no issues. In fact, the most important fact about this election, which ought to strike any M.I.T. student instantly, is that it came out a statistical tie. Now, if you pick any set of issues, pick them at random, any set of issues you can imagine, and think of the probability that millions of people will end up in a statistical tie on that set of issues, it's minuscule. The only way a thing like that can happen is if people are voting for, let's say, who should be the next president of Mars or something like that. Then it'll come out 50-50. But if there's anything at stake, it can't possibly come out 50-50. And it was, in fact, a tie, which tells you right off there's only one plausible model for it. People were, voting for something that they regarded as irrelevant. This guy has a nice smile, or this guy looks too arrogant, or something like that. And that's the overwhelming fact, meaning there wasn't an election, period. 6 weeks have been spent in massive commentary by everyone from law professors to journalists trying to persuade us that there was an election and that it mattered what technical device you pick to resolve a statistical tie. And the answer is it doesn't matter. The easy thing would be flip a coin if it's a statistical tie, and it was meaningless in the first place. But then it would be obvious that there was no election. But if we don't, but that's, this is part of the way of marginalizing the public. The policy is not made for the benefit of the public. So your questions are correct, but they go deep into the nature of what's called functioning democracy, and they're right as true here as they are in Israel.
We actually do have to close.
Yeah.
Just to be fair, we will take your last question. But you must
Yeah.
be...
Okay, hopefully this will be short.
I'll have to be quick. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about or briefly talk about the true relationship of the Christian Lebanese and the SLA and the influence in the area.
Well, that's a long, complicated story. I think probably not. The SLA is a mercenary force. It was partly Christian, partly Shiite. It was a mercenary force created by Israel to occupy the southern region. They drove out a huge number of people, and these were the people who somehow survived by collaborating. As soon as Israel withdrew, they just disappeared. It's like other mercenary armies that have been established to try to control the population. They're okay as long as the ruling power is there. Just ask yourself what happened to the black mercenaries in the Bantustans after apartheid broke down. You don't hear anything about them anymore. If people were kind, they didn't get murdered and got absorbed back into the society.
Just out of curiosity, did the Christians invite the Israeli invasion of 1982 or not?
No, the Maronites. First of all, there are many different Christians. The Maronites which is a separate group, were in favor of the Israeli invasion. And there's a long Maronite-Israel connection that goes back to the 1940s. I mean, Ben-Gurion had this idea of a Maronite state that would be an ally of Israel, and there's all kind of crazy stuff. And the Maronites hoped that and Israel intended, in fact, to impose a Maronite regime, a right-wing Maronite regime on Lebanon. That was one of the goals of the invasion. That fell apart pretty fast, and But the internal politics of Lebanon are, a horrendous mess. It's cut all sorts of ways. The original. I should say the original Syrian intervention in Lebanon back in 1976 was at with the backing of the United States and Israel because they were going to attack Palestinians, which they did. You really look into it, it's an awfully complicated story, an unpleasant story. I'm afraid we have to end. Okay, can we do one? All right, go ahead. I'll try to be brief. Yeah.
In your lecture, Professor Chomsky, you didn't relate directly to Zionism and to the fact that it actually established a system of apartheid, not for the last 50 years, I mean, from the establishment of the State of Israel, but for the last 100 years, situation in which rights are given by origin, by blood, by ethnic affiliation, and not. I think that not.
You're right, but could you get to the question? I mean,
not all the Americans know that civil rights are not assured to all the citizens, but according to origin and blood. And what is your relation to the idea of one secular democratic state in Palestine, which may be the only reasonable solution?
Well, if anybody were in favor of a secular democratic state, I think it would be a good idea, but nobody's in favor of it. The PLO talked about it for years, but they didn't believe a word they were saying. When you looked at the PLO documents of the 1970s about a democratic secular state, what they meant was, and if you look at the footnotes, they spelled it out, an Arab state, in fact, an Arab religious state, in which Jews would be granted a temporary right as a religious minority. That's not a democratic secular state. This was just lies. A democratic secular state is a nice idea, but there are very few in the world. Israel was founded pretty much on the European model, which is different from the U.S. model. The European model is one of essentially nation states. So the state is owned by a nation, and other people are kind of marginal to the nation. And it's not a pretty system. I mean, it took Europe 500 years of mutual massacre and murder to establish that horrible system. They're now slightly beginning to extricate themselves from it. The European imperialism tried to impose it on the rest of the world with horrifying results. I mean, a lot of the awful conflicts going on around the world are the effect of the effort to try to deal with the legacy of the European nation-state system that was imposed on parts of the world where it makes no sense. In fact, the Middle East is a good example. I mean, the Ottoman Empire wasn't the most beautiful thing in the world, but it was attuned to the realities of the Middle East in a way that nothing since has been. I mean, under the Ottoman Empire, there was a corrupt, ruler. There were corrupt rulers in Turkey who fortunately were so corrupt that they didn't know what was going on most of the time, which is a good thing. But they kind of left, groups alone. So there's a lot of local autonomy for religious groups, ethnic groups, and so on. And that actually fits the character of the region. In a way, it was very free. You could travel anywhere. You could travel throughout the Ottoman Empire. You didn't have to cross a customs booth, go anywhere you like. I mean, I'm not suggesting it was a pretty system. It wasn't. It was ugly. But it had a certain realism about it. And ultimately, I think that's the kind of realism that should exist in Europe and the Middle East and other places. But to try to construct it is extremely hard.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, and thank you all for coming today, staying so long. If you'd like to get more information on what action is going on grassroots here, go on the back of Presky, and there's some tables with some flyers. And thanks again for coming.